Welcome to episode 16 of the Norton Nemesis V8 rebuild, and in this episode I take the bike for its first ride, but things don't go quite to plan. I've been working really hard to get the bike finished in time for the National Motorcycle Museum live show in Birmingham at the end of October. This was a huge event with lots of people coming to see the bike go. The engine was a bit reluctant to start at first, but was soon revving freely on the live stage presentation. In all the excitement, I forgot to set up my camera, but luckily someone in the crowd filmed it on his phone. Even Bob, the museum's peacock, was keen to have a look to see what's going on with all the noise. He's so friendly. With the bike back at Henry's farm, it was time to do a proper road test up and down his drive, but things didn't turn out as well as I expected. It did run, and it sounded quite cool, but it didn't pull as well as I expected for a 1500cc V8, and it was definitely offbeat. And on closer inspection, I noticed that oil was getting pushed out of the breather into the airbox, making extra smoke that shouldn't be there. So I packed the bike up, took it back home to my workshop to take it apart to do some further investigation. I'm going to remove the fairing, the petrol tank and all the injection system and have a very close look at the injectors because I didn't check them really that thoroughly when I built the engine around the first time. So I'm going to strip all the injectors out and clean them and check they're working properly. Also, we may need to change the ECU because this is a very old ECU. We haven't got the programming software to program it, or a patch lead, or a laptop that's old enough to communicate with it. So let's get this fairing back off the bike. It's times like this that you realise how complicated some projects can be. Even though I spent quite a lot of attention to detail building the bike up the first time round, I was half expecting it to work perfect, but it didn't. But that's how it is sometimes. You just need to persevere and find the problems, sort it all out and make it work. The high pressure fuel rail pipe system is very industrial and large for its size, but it comes apart quite nicely. I fitted that fuel pressure gauge when I built the engine up so I can keep an eye on things, which was quite useful because I could see that it was running 45 psi, which is just perfect. With the high pressure flow and return pipes disconnected from the tank, I can now disconnect the 12 volt feed to the fuel pump and disconnect the rear master cylinder reservoir. The petrol tank is now ready to unbolt from the bike. It's held in by 2 bolts at the front, cap head bolts, and 2 at the rear. The front ones are relatively accessible, but the back ones are really hard to get to. With the tank securing bolts removed, I can lift the petrol tank away from the bike, and to my surprise it feels really, really light. No fuel in it at all, barely. I filled this to the brim when I was at the show, which it holds about 6 or 7 litres. So I've done a couple of minutes of revving up on stage, and a trip up and down Henry's Drive, which is a quarter of a mile each way, and I've used a whole tank. So it's not going to have a very good range, so that means it must have been running really rich. With the seat support unclipped and removed from the bike, I can access the wiring to the fuel injection system. But first, I'm going to loosen the screws on the airbox and investigate this oil leak. I think oil has been coming up the breather, up the little tiny pipe off my Z1 that I fitted to the airbox, straight into the inlet ports at the rear, because it was the rear banker cylinder that was smoking, not the front. And yes, you can see oil in that pipe. And when I turn it over at the back of the cover, it's completely drenched in engine oil, which is the indication of why it was smoking so much. In the airbox, it's saturated with oil. It's all come out the breather, straight into the engine, which is not ideal. To solve this problem, I think I'm going to make a slightly larger breather system and take it back to a catch tank, like race bikes have, rather than circulating it back into the induction system. With all the screws loosened, I lift up the airbox cover and disconnect the feed wires to the injectors and lift it all away for a closer look. It's all really oily, which in some respects is a good thing, because if it wasn't oily in there, that means the oil must have been coming from the bottom of the engine past the pistons, which would be a much worse job to fix. And look at it, it's all pooled in here, thick loads of oil. Well, this certainly explains the smoky exhaust. With the wiring loom removed, I can next remove the twin coil packs and heat shield that nestles between the engine and the frame. This reveals the 4 rear spark plugs, so I can remove one to have a look at it and see if it's all oily or messy. And when I take it out and have a close look, it's really oily. For me, the best way to clean an oiled up spark plug, especially that from one from a 2-stroke that's really badly oiled up, is to put it into the vise like this and use a blowtorch to heat it up red hot at the electrode tip. This burns off all the carbon and oil and leaves the spark plug virtually looking brand new. The disadvantage of using a wire brush is you're actually scratching iron particles across the porcelain, which can induce short circuits and make the plug foul in the future. It's quite amazing to see the carbon just burn away as it cools down. A quick squirt with an airline to finish it off, and it's virtually brand new. With the spark plugs all cleaned, I'm now going to strip down the injection system and remove the injectors. These little spring clips hold them in place, and they just pull out of the injection rail with an O-ring. And to my surprise, there's rust, lots of it, inside the injection pipework. Actually quite bad, particulate rust in there as well. And one of the injectors got a little particle of rust coming through one of the holes, which could have been causing some of the lumpy running. With the injectors removed, I can strip down the actual fuel injection rail system, disconnect it from the magnesium cover, give it a thorough clean, remove all the inspection plugs, and clean the insides as well. I've got some little rotary wire brushes that should get down the holes nicely and clean it all out, and give it a good blow through with some brake cleaner and an airline, and we should be much better than it was. When I was cleaning out the fuel input threads, some sort of fibrous wadding material came out stuck to the wire brush. Perhaps I used it on the threads to seal if the fuel leaks. I'll replace this with copper washers. It'll be a much better solution, I think. I tap the fuel rail on the bench and lots of powder comes out, like white corrosion and bits of rust. But it's looking a lot cleaner now. So now I've done the big holes, I'm going to put my smaller wire brush on and do the small taper at the end where the rubber O-ring seals. It's all starting to look much better now. I'm really pleased with that. And here's some more of that fibrous wadding, like thread sealer they used. I clean the threads at the side with a tap, just to make sure, because I haven't got a small enough wire brush to fit right down inside the threaded part. I now use a small stainless steel wire brush to clean up the outside of the fuel injection rail. While I got it all apart, I might as well give it a nice clean up. There we go, that's much better. I now use a bit of brake cleaner and an airline to clean out the internal bores just to make sure they're really clean. I'm now going to clean the injectors. I was going to buy new ones, but they're over £100 each and needs 8, which is quite a big expense. So I think it's worth getting them clean first. If I need to change them later, it's quite an easy job to do. So I put a piece of rubber on the input side. I can fill it with brake cleaner, then use my airline to blow it through, connecting the injector briefly to a battery to open it up to allow the fluid to blow through. So first of all, I fill it up with a liquid, brake cleaner, then connect the injector up to a battery, hearing it click, and I can connect my airline up and blow it through. And I get a really nice spray pattern as well, which is good, like a fan-shaped spray pattern. So that one's quite clean. I repeated this process several times to make sure it's thoroughly clean, then check that the injector clicks nicely when I disconnect the wire on and off briefly, and it does, so I think this one's okay to go. I bought some new O-rings to replace the brittle crazed ones. This should ensure a good seal when I replace them into the fuel rail. After repeating the cleaning process, all 8 injectors cleaned up nicely, so now I can start assembling them back into the fuel rails with their new O-rings, pressing them down firmly until they slide in. The second injector was a little bit tight, so a little bit of grease on the surface has helped it slide in. Just a thin smear. With the injectors reassembled into the fuel rail, I can now clean and refit the stainless steel clips. The polished stainless steel clips snap against the injector, holding it tight against the fuel rail. So here's all the 8 injectors fully assembled into independent fuel rails. So the next thing to do is fit them into the top of the airbox cover. When I took the injection system apart, the threads were sealed with some fibrous type sealing material, but I'm going to replace that with copper washers. That should give a much superior seal. The first thing I'm going to do though is anneal the copper washers. This makes them much softer so they can press down into any imperfections to make a good seal for the fuel. So I put all the seals together on a piece of stainless steel welding rod, heat up my gas blowtorch until they're glowing red hot, then drop them into some water. Or you can leave them to cool in air, it's just the same. But I prefer to drop it in water to make it safe because it doesn't burn your fingers. There we go, they're all nice and soft now and just perfect for assembly. I now use a bit of fuel-proof liquid sealer just to make sure. I apply a thin film to all the mating surfaces where the copper washers are going to seal down. This is the main high pressure fuel system, so you don't want any leaks. I also apply a bit of sealer to the threads, just to make sure. With all the sealer applied, it's time for final assembly of the injector rail system. The two injector rails bolt to the underside of the top of the airbox to point directly into the inlet ports of each cylinder. With the first injector rail in place, I tighten the flange bolts with the spanner, doing them up really tight to crush the copper washers. It's quite a fiddly job lining up the injector rail with the holes and putting all the washers in place and then putting the bolts through, but I get there in the end. I then wipe with a cloth to remove any excess sealer and we're all done. I can now refit the intake air temperature sensor. I'm investigating the possibility of fitting a new ECU to this bike to make it run nicer and make it possible to program it. So to do that, I need to find out where my trigger wheel position is in relation to the top dead centre of piston number 1. So I insert my DTI gauge down into the spark plug hole and screw it into the thread tight. Then I can rotate the crankshaft backwards and forwards, find top dead centre and observe where the trigger wheel is. There's no easy way on this engine to turn the crankshaft backwards and forwards using a spanner, so the easiest thing I could do is put it into 6th gear and rock the bike backwards and forwards by pushing on the forks until the piston on number 1 cylinder is at top dead centre, as indicated on my DTI. Once I achieved the top dead centre, I could look down at the crankshaft trigger and see where it was in relation to the crankshaft position sensor. This is the information I need to give to the company that's making the ECU. With top dead centre finally established, I count the teeth forward of the cutout to the sensor and make a note of that. The original crankshaft sensor looked a bit damaged on the end where it had been rubbing on the trigger wheel at some point, but I managed to find a new one from a Ford Mondeo that's identical. So this eliminates any possible errors. My back had been playing me up for a couple of days, so I sort of ignored it and carried on with the bike, so I was excited to be getting on with it. But then, in the middle of the night, it locked up solid, and I had to have paramedics called out, take me to hospital for some very strong drugs just to get rid of the pain. And after about 3 weeks of convalescence, I'm now back together and working okay again. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm feeling a lot better now, so I can get back on with the bike. So I'll see you all soon. We're not getting many hedgehogs come to visit recently because we're going into the hibernation period, and the last few days we've had none at all, but they'll be back in spring.